Welcome to the Berkeley Haas Center for Responsible Business Rudolph Peterson Speaker Series. The topic of today's discussion is innovations in hiring practices, encouraging social inclusion and diversity in the workplace. I'm Robert Strand, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the Center for Responsible Business here at Berkeley Haas. And today we are pleased to be joined by our good friends and colleagues from Adobe, Microsoft, IDEO, and Haas's own Professor Don Moore. Social inclusion and how to best encourage it represents a topic that permeates all levels of interest at Haas. The Center for Responsible Business is very fortunate to have a strong and active student advisory board. Through discussions with our wonderful students, we established the concept of social inclusion as a lens through which we consider everything we do. And today's event is a result of this. A number of our students proposed social inclusion and what leading companies may be doing to encourage social inclusion through their innovations in hiring practices as a topic for further discussion. Our students ran with it, and in just a moment you'll hear from one of them, Sam Penabad. And thanks to having great partners from the likes of Adobe, Microsoft, and IDEO, and our professor here at Haas, and Don Moore, who explores related topics and teaches in this area, we've got a great event in store for today. Now, just a couple of words before I turn it over to Sam. First, we believe very strongly in collaboration at the Center for Responsible Business, and today's Peterson event is evidence of this. We're very pleased to have Haas Consortium, Haas Net Impact Chapter, and Haas Tech Club as co-sponsor of today's events. Also, we highly value your input. You'll receive an electronic evaluation sent to the email address with which you signed up. Please fill out those evaluations. We actually read them. We take them into account. Yes. And also, you may win a prize if you fill it out. So keep that in mind, too. And finally, a point of note is that everything at today's event is compostable. So please use the compost bins on your way out. With that, I now turn the mic over to one of those wonderful students I mentioned before, Sam Penabad. Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Penabad. I'm a first-year MBA student here at Haas, and I'm very excited to introduce the panel on behalf of the 4 organizations that are co-sponsoring today's event. The first, the Center for Responsible Business, which Robert mentioned, is a center on campus that's focused on influencing the private sector to get companies to be more responsible, whether that means sustainable investing or sustainable food. I'm joined today by a number of members of the Student Advisory Board for the CRB, and again, as Robert mentioned, this was a topic that we were really excited about and brought to the CRB to talk about diversity and inclusion and how companies are acting socially responsible in that way. The second is Net Impact, known for being sort of an umbrella organization for students and for all things social impact. Net Impact is everything from organizing student treks to companies, such as some of the companies represented here. We host a speaker series in the fall and help prepare students for careers in social impact. So some students might be going into careers in nonprofits, foundations, or social enterprises, but others just into the private sector and really seeking to be social change agents within those companies. So Net Impact supports those students. Thirdly is the Consortium, a very important organization here at Haas and one that's really embedded in our culture. The Consortium's mission is to improve the number of underrepresented minorities in business, and it does that really by focusing at the MBA level, by engaging with students both who come from underrepresented minority backgrounds, but also students who have shown a commitment to diversity issues at their workplace. The consortium recently hosted an event on the business case for diversity, sort of a prerequisite to this discussion today, to talk to students about what the business case for diversity is in the private sector, what it means to have diverse teams, and to try and get students to develop a little bit of a toolkit around that. So we're really excited to extend on that conversation. And then lastly, the Haas Tech Club, one of the most well-attended clubs here at Haas, a lot of student interest. And the Tech Club focuses on helping students understand the tech industry and look for jobs in the tech industry. And I think one of the great parts about having the Haas Tech Club here with us today is what it represents, and showing that it's not just about developing your skills as a product manager, but also developing your skills in leading and managing diverse teams and thinking about some innovative hiring practices, as the title of today's event suggests. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don Moore to introduce our panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for joining us. It is great to be here with these three panelists, impressive panelists today. We're going to be talking about an issue that is at the very top of the priority list, that everybody inside organizations cares deeply about: how selection decisions get made for hiring and promotion. These are among the most important decisions in any organization because they determine who constitutes the organization and the opportunities for people who apply and for people inside. I want to give them time to talk, so I'll invite them to introduce themselves with an explicit invitation to boast about the great work that their companies are doing. These are high-profile and incredibly important companies in this space, desirable places to work that are influential more broadly in organizations in our country and around the world. So from Adobe, IDEO, and Microsoft. So Liz, if you want to start, that'd be great.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Liz. It's really great to be here today. It was just 2 years ago that I was completing my MBA at Haas and taking a course with Don Moore.
She survived anyway.
Bringing it back around. A quick note on my background before I chat about the work that we're doing at Adobe. The thread of human-centered design and business as a lever for social change has been a thread throughout my career. So I started in the Peace Corps doing microfinance in Central America, and then worked at a social innovation consulting firm, helping businesses align their strategy with their social impact. And now currently I'm innovation lead for the social impact and sustainability team at Adobe here in San Francisco. The program and the focus of today's talk will be around the Adobe Digital Academy in terms of thinking about innovations in hiring practices. So we're all very aware of the issues surrounding diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. The Digital Academy came about, or was built, as a potential alternative on-ramp into entry-level technical roles for non-traditional candidates. The Digital Academy is split into two parts. The first part of the program offers low-income, underrepresented minorities scholarships and living stipends to attend a web development immersive course with one of our partners, one of our education partners. After ongoing feedback on their technical abilities from that course and support from Adobe while they're in the web development immersive course, the individuals are then matched for a technical internship or apprenticeship at Adobe, during which time they're offered a number of support mechanisms, which we can go into more later, but then with the ultimate goal of a conversion to full-time. And although we just launched a year ago, and there's still lots of learnings and iterations on the program, we've had a 70% conversion rate from the internship positions into full-time roles. And we're right now at the point of scaling and going beyond the web development course into other areas, as well as moving beyond just the San Francisco pilot into some of our other offices. And as I mentioned, it's just a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists as well as the questions that the students have in order to inform some of the growth as we move forward with the Digital Academy.
Can you say a couple words about how you select students into the Digital Academy?
Yes, of course. So it's a partnership between the social impact team and HR, so myself and a woman from my talent partner on the program. We have a number of nonprofit partners that have learned about the Digital Academy, and that's sort of one avenue, but then also our education partners, so General Assembly, Dev Bootcamp, and Galvanize advertise the program to their networks. And then we receive those applications once they've gone through the education partner's initial screening process. We have a set of structured questions that we use the same each time, and we're really looking for 4 basic criteria in the individuals. We're looking for past career success. So as I mentioned, non-traditional technical candidates don't have a technical background, but some way of showing that they have been successful in a previous career, communication skills, teamwork skills, and then ability to integrate feedback. And based on those criteria, we interview candidates, and then those candidates go on to take the education component. And if they make it through that, then they come in-house for the internship component.
Great. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah.
Virginia?
Hi, my name is Virginia Martinez-Martin, and I'm also excited to be back on campus. A little bit about my background. I've got a little over 15 years of experience in recruiting in all flavors of it. I worked at an agency doing, placement and temporary placements, and then kind of graduated into campus recruiting, where I worked at the Boston Consulting Group for many years recruiting MBAs. And that brought me then to the Haas School of Business with the MBA Career Services team here, where I spent 4 years as the employer relations manager for management consulting, innovation and design, CPG, retail, et cetera. And then I spent a year with our exec ed team as well. So that was really fascinating because I had always been on the talent acquisition side and working with L&D teams internally, and L&D is learning and development, to figure out learning solutions and how do you keep people in the door once you get them in the door. But most recently, I find myself now at IDEO, where I've been there for 8 months, and I'm leading recruiting for the San Francisco office. So, and I won't let you down, true to IDEO form, I carry Post-its and Sharpies in my pocket, and because I don't want to forget anything. But I think what's interesting about what I find myself working on there with my team, not alone by any means, but we're an organization that gets paid to recreate the wheel, right? We won't leave well enough alone. And so how do we balance both being creative and playful and constantly reinventing ourselves with some consistency and actually creating best practices when we're constantly thinking about next practices? And so this is really interesting when you think about just good recruiting and talent and sort of process hygiene, as well as how it applies to diversity and inclusion. So that's kind of what we're working on at IDEO right now.
Thanks.
Great.
Devin?
Hello, my name is Devin Vaughn, and I'm from Microsoft. So traveled down here from our Redmond headquarters near Seattle. But my role at Microsoft is a diversity program manager within our global talent acquisition function, so recruiting. I started at Microsoft as a university recruiter for about 2.5, 3 years, and then actually moved into the diversity space of talent acquisition. About a year ago, I had the opportunity to move into a unique section of diversity where I focus on inclusive hiring for people with disabilities. Most notably of that work is our autism hiring program, which I manage at Microsoft. And this program is a unique way for candidates to be both considered for roles at Microsoft through an inclusive hiring experience, as well as additional support for the onboarding so that they can really kind of come into their own and be productive team members at Microsoft. This hiring process, we really kind of took what our typical hiring process looks like and completely adapted it, tweaked it, hacked it, whatever you want to call it, to really match up with the skill sets of someone on the autism spectrum and how they think through problems and how they communicate. So a few kind of examples of that is that when they opt into the program, they're recruited and considered for all open roles at Microsoft. So it's not particular roles, but it's just a unique experience. And they're actually come to our headquarters for 1 week. And by having them at our company for a longer period of time, we're able to get to know them on a deeper level, as well as remove some of the stress and pressure that I'm sure anyone experiences through that hiring and interviewing process. Again, then once they come on board, we have additional support in place. So in addition to a manager and a team mentor, They also have access to a community mentor who is someone from the autism community at Microsoft. And they really help with the cultural change of how they get adapted into our culture at Microsoft and how they make all of those connections across a very robust, large company. As well as we also have external job coaches that help them with that transition and can also be a liaison to their personal life and help support that transition if they're moving across the country, across the state, or just switching into a completely different career path.
Thanks. We would love to take your questions. We have a microphone cube that will make its way around the room. And would love to open it up. While you're summoning up the courage to ask your first question, I'll start off. Something that my guess is many people in the room are wondering about has to do with how they can help in the effort. If diversity and inclusion is not part of their job description, if they aren't in a privileged position, as the three of you are, of being able to influence these things directly in their work, what can they do as junior members of an organization to help promote diversity and inclusion?
I'm happy to, I have something sort of really brief on this, is that there's often the assumption or sort of a very easy answer to think that to solve diversity and inclusion, you sort of point to recruiting, because it's the top of the funnel. It's how people get into the organization. However, if there's a challenge within in an organization around diversity, inclusion, and equity, that sort of means like if everyone's kind of part of the problem or challenge, then everyone has to be part of the solution. And so I think encouraging folks to speak up and all the time and share their ideas around how to solve for that is extremely important. Because it can't be sort of like, this is the department that's going to solve it, right? So.
I would say specifically in terms of the program that I'm managing, and then also thinking about broader implications at Adobe, the three things that come to mind. The first is being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. I think oftentimes it's easy to go about business as usual, and whether it is hiring decisions or if it's just other practices that you see happening at the company, being willing to be that person to start the conversation. Even if you feel uncomfortable saying something and you're not quite sure how to word something or the sensitivity around it, I would encourage you to step up and take that role. The second piece really applies to the Digital Academy, but we are so reliant on everyone across the company for this program's success. So whether if it's a hiring manager that's willing to take on an intern and open up their team, or if it's a mentor, which we have a robust mentorship program around the Digital Academy, but willing to spend extra time outside of your workday, making sure that the workplace is an inclusive place and that someone that might need more support has that support available. And then the third piece, I think, really being willing to reach out into the community and see if there are individuals beyond your direct network that you think could benefit from, whether it's a program your company is running or an open role. Because I think too often we just rely on our direct network without thinking about how does the company represent the community that it's actually in.
The only thing I really have to add is just practicing it within your classes, in your own community, really the collaboration piece, because I think too, as you prepare for interviews at companies, I can't think of one company that doesn't care about collaboration, and it's more about collaborating with people that are different from you or have different points of views or are going to tackle work differently. And so being able to practice that here and then bring that into the interview and more importantly into that workplace where you go, I think is just really important. I think it's something that more and more companies are really looking for and actually asking questions around in interviews.
The box here. So this is just the fair warning. This is the box, and it can be thrown. So, and it's not just if your hand goes up, but it's also if your head's down like this. Then you're a real prime candidate. So we actually have a question from one of our members of our student advisory board for the CRB to kick us off here, please. And if you'd say who you are and your year.
Sure. Thank you all. I'm Mikhail. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board as well as a consortium fellow, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at Haas. So my question is, could you talk about examples of leadership at each of your firms, not just promoting the programs and initiatives that you're speaking to, but participating in them, as well as ways that the programs that you support may encourage diversity at the top C-suite level? Thanks.
I can kick that one off. One, I think having the commitment from leadership at a company is so important because they have the ability to influence kind of the masses, as well as to put money, resources, funding, whatever it is, behind those programs for then people like me to go out and actually do the work. So at Microsoft, all of our programs have executive sponsors tied to it to really help encourage that throughout the organization, and it really helps us be able to move much quicker and scale and scope and make a broader impact. So for the particular program, the Autism Hiring Program, we actually have two executive sponsors, Mary Ellen Smith, who's our Vice President of Operations at Microsoft, and then also Jenny Lee Fleury, who is our Chief Accessibility Officer at Microsoft. And both of them were actually kind of brought to the program from the very beginning. They had a passion for autism hiring. They both have children on the autism spectrum, so it was very kind of near and dear to their heart, and they saw that not all hiring practices are inclusive to those individuals. And Mary Ellen Smith personally had her son kind of at that stage in his life where he was going out to look for employment, and she saw some of the roadblocks and hurdles that were particularly challenging to him. So they were the ones that kind of thought up this idea and actually created a team to then go and kind of put it into execution. So incredibly impactful. They have participated from the beginning. So at the beginning of the program, before anyone knew at Microsoft what it even was, they were the ones saying like, hey, like you're gonna recruit from these teams within my organizations. Here are open roles that you can go fill, which to start it off is pretty important because it is a bit of a risk with any new program that comes to fruition. As well as when we do inclusive hiring events for people of all disabilities, Jenny Lee Fleury, our Chief Accessibility Officer, actually volunteers to get lunch with each and every one of those candidates, which I know makes every candidate feel incredibly special that she's taking that time out of her day to connect with them on a personal level. And I know that she enjoys it so much as well.
I have two examples of how this has come up, at least in the San Francisco office. First is recently, you know, with the political campaign before the election being so what it was, there were a lot of feelings internally about what is going on, what are we doing? We're being sort of reflective and saying like, you know, we could be better about social inclusion here at IDEO. So instead of sort of saying like, okay, we'll fix it, or hey, employee resource group, go ahead, there was a little task force put together to sort of start digging at the data to see like, what do we know? And not only was it sort of all various levels of designers at IDEO, but also one of the partners that leads the San Francisco office sat on this group, as well as a very senior leader of one of our studios, which is sort of like what you would call a department or anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is that you had these very senior people side by side with junior designers at IDEO sort of digging into the data and having the conversation. The idea being that this is so important that it can't just be bottom up or top down. It's going to be like everyone, right? The other example I have about that, which is going back to your point about being comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, I cannot stress this enough. And be comfortable that in the beginning you're going to have really clunky and awkward things until you figure it out. But there was a partner in our office who, you know, looked at her own team and said, there's a lot of white women on my team. I would like my next hire to be a diverse hire because, you know, it's just, there's proven, you know, science behind the fact that the more different perspectives you have, the more creative you'll be. And if we're an organization that prides ourselves on creativity, then you need to have different perspectives in the room, especially around the clients that we were working with, that this was just kind of getting to the point where it felt funny. Interestingly enough, like some people were like, oh, that's so strange that she's like pounding the table for a diverse hire, like, and that became sort of like, how do we have that conversation? Like, can you bring that up? Are you allowed to acknowledge it? And I don't know if this is right or not, but I can tell you that my feeling is like, you know, I'm short and Latina, and there's enough that you can say like, oh, we should hire more short Latina women, and then people kind of roll their eyes like, of course you think that, Virginia. But it's going to take like a white woman who's a partner to say, I want to hire a person of color into the next position because it's hurting us with clients, like to push that agenda. And that conversation may be super awkward in the beginning, but it's a dialogue that needs to happen. So those are ways that leadership, at least in the San Francisco office, are definitely involved.
And from Adobe's perspective, also after the election, our CEO came out with a letter just letting employees know that we would remain an inclusive workplace. And I think having that voice from the leadership just really helps set the tone and continue to place the emphasis on remaining inclusive and in terms of hiring practice as well as just how the workplace runs. But I really do think it is, I mean, it's been mentioned, but this top-down and bottom-up approach. So speaking specifically to the Digital Academy, it didn't come from a leadership initiative or from the top. It was something that we said, okay, from the social impact team, we're going to incubate this program. And HR said, well, you know, we'll interview people. We'll see if maybe this works. But they sort of had a lot of doubt in terms of the program. But it was as soon as they were not only interviewing and then hiring and then people were being converted to full-time positions, that's more when leadership started to say, okay, we're really behind this and we'll support it. So I think you have to also always remember it comes from both directions. And I think that gets at your second question as well in terms of looking at hiring for the C-suite. Sometimes you wish that it came directly from Virginia's case, from someone saying we need to hire more people, but sometimes it's also someone that keeps getting promoted that ends up making it in that slot. So I think always taking that holistic view on the approach.
Well, right next and look, we'll go here and people, just because you're sitting in the back, I still have my eye on you.
Hi, I'm Chen. I'm also a first-year MBA student and one of the co-presidents of the consortium here. And I'm curious to know what spaces or structures your organizations are using to ensure that the communities that you're trying to serve and support are involved in the actual creation of the programs and the processes that you're developing.
Yeah, so in terms of the Digital Academy, as I mentioned, we source a lot of the candidates from our nonprofit partners. So examples of that, Hack the Hood, which is based out of the East Bay, Year Up, and then we have sort of our younger youth coding partners that we're hoping will eventually funnel into this program. But really having all of the feedback on how I iterate the program coming from the individuals that are selected into the program itself. So just last week, I was over at General Assembly having lunch with a current batch of students and asking them what additional support do you need, what mechanisms need to be in place, and they're the ones actually from the community and in the program and able to shape what ends up then fitting into Adobe and then how Adobe continues to build structures of support. So an example from one of our earlier cohorts, they felt that they wished they'd had more support while they were students in the web development immersive course. So now there's an additional mentorship program where alum of the Digital Academy or individuals that are now interns or full-timers mentor the current students. And that only came about by having that constant feedback loop. And I hope as the program continues to evolve and the candidates go on to full-time roles across the company, they'll continue to be able to pass the opportunity on to their own network as well as continue to feed in feedback to continue to grow the program.
We also are very close to disability communities and the autism community when it comes to the recruiting and how we're building the programs. When we first decided to launch our autism hiring program, we worked with an organization called Special Esterna, if you've heard of it, and they specialize in autism employment. And so we really tried to go to the experts to get kind of the best starting place that we could be in. But when we launched, our program was completely different from what it is today. And it's because you have to start somewhere, and then you take those learnings and you apply them and you adapt it. And it was through a lot of feedback from both our candidates that we were bringing in and from the business of what made sense from Microsoft, as well as continued feedback from those other partnerships and partnerships with Special Esterna of what makes sense for the community, the candidate, and us. And so we went from our first hiring event was 4 weeks in length. That's what was recommended, is that we needed to bring in these candidates for 1 month to Microsoft to be able to evaluate them in an inclusive way. And it was great to start there, but now we're down to 1 week, 2 years later. So being able to continue to refine and have that feedback loop, I think, is incredibly important. As well as specifically just from a hiring perspective, autism is a non-visible disability. So when you think of how you're going to recruit individuals for roles to promote neurodiversity at your company, you need to be in tune with those organizations so that they know where to find you. Because it's not, otherwise we have no idea, they have no idea, and they'll go through the typical hiring process instead of through a program that's adapted to really help them be successful.
Okay. I didn't know if you were.
You don't have to feel pressured.
No, I didn't know. You look like you were going to throw the cue.
Your prompt here, Virginia, please.
So irrelevant of IDEO, but as my career in recruiting, I've always felt there's sort of there's probably more, but 3 different flavors of recruiting kind of. And so to use an analogy, there's fishing, and sort of campus recruiting is a perfect example of this, right? You know, when it's fishing season, you know where the pond is. If you have good enough bait, you'll probably walk away with some fish, right? So as an organization, campus recruiting is very much like fishing. Then there's more like hunting. That's kind of where headhunting comes from, where you sort of track who you want to find, you sort of go where they go, but then you pounce, right? I know, maybe not the best analogies, but go with me. The third one is the worst, but the one I use the most is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and that one is sort of I know it sounds terrible, but what I mean by that is it's not enough to say oh, I wish we found more diverse engineers. Go where the engineers are, where are they hanging out? Try to be one of them. Don't expect that they're going to find us. And this is true. This has been true throughout my entire career. So it's not enough to sort of just think they're going to find you. So go where they are, right? And hang out with them and become one of them. And then you sort of are in the community. That's extremely important. And with that said, sort of building on this question, the recruiting team is extremely lean at IDEO, which most people don't realize. And so one of the tricks that has been wonderful for us is leveraging the employee resource groups that are so eager to do more. And so they are usually the ones bringing all these amazing networking events to me. And there's only one of me, and we have a team of 3. We can't clone ourselves to go to all these things, but they feel so empowered to represent us nonetheless through a recruiting lens. And so it's been fantastic in that sense. They're finding all these events and networks that they want to go to. And so we've been partnering very closely with them on that.
Personal referrals are obviously a very useful way that organizations gain new members. Evidence suggests that people brought in through personal referrals perform better and last longer. And if your employee workforce is not diverse, it can represent an impediment to increased diversity. So tapping those resource groups to get more referrals can be very helpful.
I think one of the interesting things is, yes, referrals are a really powerful way, but it is very, it can sort of create you keep kind of hiring people that look and feel and sound like you.
Yep.
And so one of the things we've played around with at IDEO is well, what do we do with our referral process, right? Some organizations have done away with it entirely. And we're well, what if we lean into it? What if instead of trying to find a middle ground, we're push people to say not only are we asking you for your referrals, but now we are challenging you to go beyond and can you find us not just another engineer, can you find us a female engineer out there who wants to work at IDEO, won't get paid Facebook money, and all these things. So maybe True. But sort of putting the challenge out there as well. So if people are so eager to give referrals, like making it a little bit more playful, right? Yeah.
Wait, I didn't even get a chance to catch it. Hi, I'm Kim Miller-Hershon. I am a community member, not an MBA student. But I have actually really two questions. One goes back to the question around the internal conversations. So I'm curious if you have anything to say about unconscious bias. And the second question is to turn sort of your question around. You asked the question initially around what can you do internally in an organization. My question is, as a candidate, is there anything that you can do to advocate for diversity, inclusion? I know it's kind of a hard question to answer maybe, but I'm interested in what you have to say about it.
As a candidate applying? Or?
Exactly.
Another version of that question that I've heard students pose to me is, how can I tell if a company that I'm looking at is one that is supportive of diversity? What clues should I look for other than people like you in important roles?
Speaking of the unconscious bias, so I think that one, that's like a very trendy term, right? A lot of people use it. I think that has a lot of merit, but as words get trendy, it also gets like some negative connotations with it. I think the first step for an organization is to realize that there are biases and some of them are unconscious. And then what are you going to do to correct it? I think a lot of organizations like Microsoft have come out with trainings to try to showcase like what could be a bias and then how do you kind of approach it. I would say two areas that Microsoft in particular has been successful in starting to move the dial there. By no means are we at like the end and like job well done for us. But one is we've started giving our recruiters more tools of how do you approach a hiring manager or an interviewer when you see them have an unconscious bias. Because usually, if you have an unconscious bias, you don't know, obviously, that you have it. So someone needs to tell you, and whose place is it to tell you, and how do you have that conversation? Again, back to those challenging conversations. And so providing coaching to all of our recruiters of when you see people making decisions that aren't right for Microsoft, how do you approach it, and how do you push back to have a behavior change? And so I think that that's been really instrumental in just giving the tools to people who have the right, and it's part of their function to call that out to someone. The other one that's more broader across Microsoft is we started doing this really unique training, and it's one of the most unique ones I've ever done. It's called Dialogue Across Differences, and anyone in human resources or who's a manager does this training, and it's an in-person training where they fly in actors from New York City to wherever you're located, and they represent different diversity segments and teams at Microsoft. And you literally are kind of in an audience like this, and the actors are up here in like a mock conference room, and they play out scenarios that have happened at Microsoft or other tech companies, and you get to see it real life and then have a discussion with the entire room on how could that a person approach that differently, what did they say that was offensive, and it's literally 3 hours of having tough conversations, talking about gender, talking about race, talking about disabilities. And I think bringing everyone together and seeing it more so in a real world experience and then interacting is so beneficial. For example, during this, at the beginning, they asked like, raise your hand if you're a feminist. And because Microsoft is more male dominated, there was a lot of guys in the audience and maybe like 2 of them raised their hand. And then the moderator was like, okay, let's talk about what feminism means. Like it just means that they're equal. Like that's all it means. Now who like believes in feminism? And everyone raised their hand. So I think it's sometimes like you just don't talk about it in the workplace. And so opening up that dialogue to have those conversations, I think is a really good first step.
And I was thinking about your second question in terms of what a candidate can do. And I think it really is applicable for anyone applying for a position, whether or not you're advocating for a diversity and inclusion sort of, or if you're trying to figure out if the company has that as a priority. And it's really about can you find opportunities that the company is missing? So a lot of what we think about in terms of having diverse product teams is they're able to represent our customers and the communities where we're trying to sell our products. And so if coming in as a potential candidate, you're able to highlight something that the team as it currently is has overlooked or maybe has a blind spot towards, then I think it can be really beneficial. I think we've seen already, I got to sit in on an intern presentation last week, and the solutions that she'd come up with for one of our photo products, she was able to really identify something that the team just hadn't been able to understand themselves from their own perspective. So bringing in that alternative viewpoint, I think, is really important. And then to your first question, in terms of unconscious bias, I think back 2 years ago when we were first starting to talk about running this program, and technically it's more of an apprenticeship because right when you're finished, you're eligible to convert into a full-time role. And when we brought it to two heads of two of our very big products, they were really hesitant. They had always hired from the top 10 universities, individuals with 4-year CS degrees, and they said, no way can someone with this really short boot camp cut it against these individuals. So what we had to do was take the conversation back and just talk about the actual opportunities that you're afforded at different points in your life and how then that allows you to be even aware of a career in technology or be able to get into this top 10 university. And I think by just level setting that conversation, it really helped change the perspective in terms of how they were thinking about both the program and just the product and diversity and inclusion.
I think one of the ways that we similarly try to get ahead of this so that it's not like, oh, Stanford computer science, because it's very easy kind of thing to get into, is if there is going to be a coding test, put it up front. If there's going to be a homework assignment, put it up front. I mean, you'll interact with someone first. This seems really like, for the candidate, it might seem like they're really investing a whole lot of time in us before they've had a chance to feel us out. But in a way, it's very helpful for us because internally we can say, like, the work speaks for itself. And then let's dig into the resume and things like that. That's been really helpful for us. And it doesn't have to be major things. Like we've put more, we call them pop quiz questions on our application. Sort of like how might someone answer a question in a certain way that we think is really like an attribute we're trying to get at. And so we start there before even digging into the resume so that we don't jump into the like, oh, they worked at this company and that company. But again, like it's small things. Like something recently came up at work where we have a transgender employee and they had shared their experience sort of being onboarded. And so, one way to do it is like you could sort of remedy those situations for the employee, but we decided like, why stop there? There's so many touch points, to your point, when you're a candidate or a client or someone visiting the office, what can we make it clear to others that we are inclusive? So obviously, bathroom signs is one thing, but we also put it out to the community, like help us design a really inclusive bathroom sign, like we make it part of the community. When you're onboarded, you're asked, what's your preferred pronoun? When you're given a tour of our space, no matter who you are, if you're a class visiting or a client or what have you, we point out our, gender neutral or whatever it is, sort of, they're just bathrooms basically. And we call those things out to put those signals out there that we have these artifacts of our culture that speak to inclusive, nature.
All right. Ava, can you catch this? And then
No.
we're gonna do this.
Heads up.
Whoa,
I always warn not to hit anyone in the head.
Do you have a question?
No.
All right. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Christy Ravi. I'm on faculty here. You've talked a lot about how you get what I would consider more entry-level new people into the field. But it's well known that for women, particularly in the tech sector, it's fairly horrific. A lot of this bro culture. You probably read the Atlantic magazine this month has the cover story is all about diversity in the tech sector. And I'm wondering, if you could talk a little bit about women and how you get women, create an environment where they feel valued and where they get promoted and where it isn't, the bro culture at the top. Thanks.
The question connects closely to issues that I've heard from students around culture fit. If in making selection decisions, you're pattern matching to the people you've seen successful at the firm, and there aren't enough women represented at the top, that's going to be a challenge.
So I'm coming from the social impact team today, so I can speak less articulately about those programs that we have in place. It's actually another Haas alum, Kate Morris, who manages a lot of those programs from the HR perspective. But I know she's really been pushing in terms of thinking about how do you make the workplace sustainable in terms of a place for whatever a female's choices may be in terms of having a family or not having a family, but how do you keep the individual in the workplace? And then the other sort of very early stage program that we're thinking about is a returnship, or if you're re-entering the workforce after some time off, and how can that be structured in order to create that ramp, as you said, that's not for an entry-level position, but for someone that does have extensive career experience, but maybe has taken some time off, and how do they come back and still be able to be successful in their career. So those are sort of the two things. I wouldn't want to speak too in depth to them today, but that's sort of some of the things that are happening at Adobe.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not specifically super in-depth in this space. The way that Microsoft is structured is we actually have diversity and inclusion program managers that are aligned to each business. So there would be someone who functions as like an HR manager would at any company, but they're specifically focused only on the individuals within that organization that are diverse, to really kind of keep track of like what's going well within an org, what needs work, how do we alter that. I think we're at the very beginning of that journey, to be super transparent, but we have a lot of focus and intention around it. Some of the ways that I've seen them engage kind of within the larger community and group is really around like mentorship and having additional mentorship out of just like how do I do better at my job, but like how do I approach those difficult conversations? How do I really command a meeting? Because it's fact that women are interrupted 3 times more in a meeting than men as a counterpart. So like, how do you take that, and that's not okay, but how do you then go into that meeting and really kind of demand it and have, again, those challenging conversations so that that is no longer the statistic. But really, that's like such a big question, and I think that, again, there's a lot of thought and intention in all of technology around how to solve it, but I don't think Microsoft's there yet, and I don't know if any company has really quite figured that one out.
I would say like this isn't too, I mean, I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but it's not as much of a challenge. We have really great representation of women, and right now our pipeline to leadership skews 2/3 women to men. I would also say, even speaking personally, it's the place where I found the most work-life balance, if that's one of the things we want to discuss. And the thing I think serves IDEO well in this case is that is also the most place where you can be like most authentically yourself. So there's less of this, how am I supposed to behave? There really isn't a bro culture. There's probably more of like a sensitive creative designer culture, but like there's there's no bro culture. And but the ability to be authentically yourself is a little bit, you don't have that sort of like, oh, I need to behave a certain way to succeed here. So we see challenges, but I don't think it's probably as much as in the tech sector.
And a good way to look at that is to really look up the board of directors and top leadership at a company and see who's there. So like, although I said like Microsoft's struggling, like half of our VPs are women. So like they've made it there. It's just a matter of like, okay, like how do we make it where it's not such a battle to get there, right? And how do we encourage those who leave the labor force to provide an inclusive option so they don't have to? But really, I think that's the best indicator to see if a company does is like, show us that you're really working towards it. Like, who are your board of directors? Who are your top leaders? And if you don't have any, then like, what are they really doing now to make sure that they can have them in the future?
Please. What are the Cubas, man?
Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Yves Petit. I am actually one of the co-presidents of the consortium. I just had a question in regards to, I think, some of the partnerships and just kind of, I guess, really kind of tapping into the outside the typical network. So I think you guys talked about the local nonprofits that you can access, but I'm just wondering if there are any like plans or current partnerships that you have in place to kind of really tap outside that network. I know like Google, for instance, has a partnership with a lot of the historical Black colleges and universities. So I'm just wondering if you guys have anything in that realm or anything with, you know, like the professional organizations of different races.
Yeah, no, Google actually started a phenomenal thing at some of the HBCUs where they have a Googler who teaches CS 101, for those of you who aren't aware. And it's something that I think a lot of people, including Microsoft, have looked at and really said like, oh, like, should we mirror this? Like how does that work? And so I think it's on our radar for sure. And I think it's phenomenal that Google kind of took the step to try it first and like see how it goes. We as well are pretty involved with the HBCUs, although not giving them our technical staff to like support it. One of the things that Microsoft's really focused on is we actually created and program manage a program called TEALS, which allows for developers at Microsoft or any of our competitors, anyone in the industry. We have a ton of people from Facebook, Google, around the country, that they actually teach a first period or a sixth period computer science to high school students at local schools or AP computer science classes. So it allows them to get their six-figure salary working at a top tech company, but then being able to donate their time and teach students. And what we found is that that really helps promote diversity because they have access to it. I know when I was in high school, we did not have CS classes. I didn't even think about studying CS when I was in college because I feel like I was already kind of on a track to go business, and I didn't really open up my thought process to like consider it. And so I think allowing access at that point in the process where it's still so early and you can still gain all of those skills before entering the workforce is really important. From the disability perspective in particular, since that's kind of like the area of my, one of the areas of my focus, we connect with a lot of different organizations, like Lyme Connect is a network of people with disabilities that are college students getting hired, Bender, like literally, like we will connect and try anything, right? I think it's all about like taking a risk and seeing like how you can work with that partner to see results and build a great partnership. So I think that honestly partnerships are always evolving, and as new organizations come to light, it's great to have those conversations.
You got the cube? Choose the next one.
Thanks very much, Richard, also an MBA student. Just curious about what are you seeing in terms of which framing works best? A lot of the framing we've heard today about the rational reasons why inclusion needs to be done. You mentioned women being interrupted, you mentioned the business case, you mentioned the differences in opportunities. I know there's a call to action from some other schools of thought. Tina Wilson, she's got this book on Nudge the Elephant. She's an anthropologist and she's saying, whatever you do, don't mention the word inclusion. Don't mention the word diversity. A lot of people don't want to hear those words anymore, especially those in the vanguard, they roll their eyes. And so she's saying different approaches. She's saying we want to create thriving cultures. No one can disagree with that. We want to make sure you never have more than 70% of a single gender or a single ethnicity on a team. No one can disagree with that. And just curious, have you found the same issue? And what framing are you considering going forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump at this one. Again, having the tough conversations, there is something to be said when you bring up the word diversity inclusion. Someone immediately is like, I am not racist. And you're like, no, 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 we're not saying you're racist. No, we're just saying like, we could be better. And so you then like, And then you, like, that happens, you know, and so you never want someone to get defensive or feel like you're telling them they're doing something wrong. So to your point, things like creating this sort of like shared language or better language or sort of shared understanding, and nudging that way. So one thing that the recruiting team at IDEO does is sort of like, how can we best facilitate these conversations to get curious and ask questions so that someone says like, oh, you know what, we should hire another Liz. Liz is great. And that's like sort of like one of these things, like kind of like unconscious bias that creeps in. It's like, she's doing a great job, but so instead of sort of hiring another Liz, we ask questions like, what are the attributes, right? And things like, oh, they'd be a great cultural fit. Recruiting will ask like, well, might they be like a better cultural alignment? Where are they gonna push us, right? So it's a very different question, sort of, so we're like, don't tell anyone, I know we're being recorded. We're getting away from saying cultural fit, for example. But those are things that we're not announcing, like you can no longer say cultural fit. We're doing it sort of in those one-on-one conversations around cultural alignment or asking better questions like, how does this person push us? How are they gonna complement us? Like, do they get us to think a different way? How is the team constructed now where, you know, we could get like an edge candidate, right? And these are all ways of thinking about having different perspectives on the team without talking about diversity and inclusion. So you're right, like having that ability of that vocabulary or way to sort of get at it in a more organic way has done wonders, because people get defensive when you bring up those words or roll their eyes, right?
I think it's also educating what is diversity, because I think you automatically go to a few kind of types of diversity. And many people may not think, for instance, disability would be included in that, or they may not think like different culture as far as like geographic area that they came from kind of incorporates into that. And diversity is such like a wider breadth. So like, for instance, we consider our military hiring program of veterans a diversity program. Now, do they kind of check all the boxes if you're defining diversity as a really limited kind of scope? No, but they bring a very diverse thought process, skill set, attitude to Microsoft. And so I think it's really also educating the teams and the company on what really is diversity, because it's really been kind of limited in like the media and the way that we talk about it on a regular basis, and it means so much more than that.
There are two things that I'll add to it. The first, I think when you do use the language of diversity and inclusion, something that we were speaking to before the panel is that it can tap at individual values and then company values as well, which I do think is really important, especially from the business setting. We often want to talk about the business case, but there's something to be said, especially in terms of retention for talent. If you're able to connect with an employee's values and say that this is the value of the company, then I think sometimes that language of diversity and inclusion can be useful. That being said, I think internally oftentimes we talk more about just representing the community that we're located in, as well as the customers that we want to serve. So not without using the diversity and inclusion language, it's just, if we have offices just in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, Emeryville, and San Jose, how do we represent those communities and how do we serve the customers?
Hi. I've never spoken into a box before.
It's working out for you.
It's good, it's good. So I actually have a comment and then also a question. To the question about how as a candidate you can encourage, what? Oh, yes, I'm a second-year MBA student, and I'm also on the CRB Student Advisory Board. And so in response, partly in response to your question about how candidates can encourage more diversity, actually one of my classmates sitting behind me talked about asking prospective employers for their diversity stats or what they're doing to promote diversity during the interview process. And I thought that was a really powerful way of signaling that that's important as a candidate, and something that, imagine if everyone in this room asked that question, that would go a long way. So just comment. And then the question, so we've talked about retention has come up a lot throughout this panel. And I'm curious how each of you measures success in terms of retention. And if you could just share a little bit more, anything you've learned about retention, because it's, as we've all said, it's one thing to get people in the door, and it's another thing entirely for people to feel at home and like this company is a place where they want to stay.
From the perspective of the Digital Academy, in terms of measuring success around retention, the data point that once we go beyond year one in pilot phase we'll start to collect is in terms of how quickly do individuals get promoted past this entry-level technical position. So this sort of gets at questions that have been raised before, but the position that the interns are converted into is a new entry-level position that isn't normally recruited for in the Bay Area because of where candidates typically come from. So we've opened up this new role, and from there we're saying how quickly can the individual then progress past. And I think a lot of the other components of success around that is how much the individual is also able to feel included in a part of the program moving forward. So being able to take on these mentorship roles and really have a sense of responsibility on the program's success. And then another component that I think about that I think is more geared towards the actual role that I'm in is in terms of the greater social impact of an individual. So right now it's all anecdotal evidence, but we had a young woman who grew up in East Palo Alto and was able to say now that she's in this full-time role and went from earning $30K a year to $100K a year, she's able to, for the first time, think about moving out of her home and where she grew up. She's able to think about helping her cousins out in her greater family, and then being able to think about her own family and how that progression goes as well. So I think those are much more difficult to measure, but something that I think about for year 3, being able to start to have some sort of data collection around those greater impacts and measures of success in terms of, because the program's focused on the low income component, how can we measure what that changes as well?
The issue of retention is one that universities have struggled with for a very long time. So admitting a more diverse student body is only the first step. If underrepresented minorities drop out at higher rates, you're failing in that mission. And so you have seen the programs at this institution attempts to run to help prepare first-generation students to succeed and help diverse students feel included in the broader community. It's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
One last question?
One last quick question.
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm also a first-year MBA student, and I sit on the academics arm of our Racial Inclusion Initiative. My question is actually around this idea of allyship, and so I know you guys are doing really amazing work to bring folks of color from non-traditional backgrounds into your organizations. Can you talk about what you're doing to help, for example, your white employees or your male employees or your sort of neurotypical employees create more inclusive cultures for their colleagues?
I think some of the quick things that I think about is just having an individual from a different background hosted on a team. That to me has been the quickest way to see change, because immediately an individual becomes invested in a fellow team member. They're able to hear about their story, where they grew up, what that was like. And I think that personal connection is what can be the most powerful in terms of broadening your perspective.
I think this is really interesting because we do have a lot of allies at IDEO, and there's also this opportunity to think about that sometimes a group just wants a safe space as well. So, and so knowing at least the sort of how that group feels about it is really important to start off, because there's this urge like, well, they're so committed to our goals and our objectives as well, let's let them in. But there's something to be said about having a safe space as well. So first I would say just kind of make sure the group sort of agrees on that. But there are opportunities, whether it's like either that group can have one-off events or invite people in. One example is recently our Prideo group. There was an ally that said, you know, my son recently came out and I'd really love to be part of Prideio to kind of like better understand. And so the group spoke about it before and they're like, absolutely, you know, come on in. But I think kind of letting the group decide is really important. Because I can tell you, I've been on the situation where I'm in that group and sort of there's this sort of assumption that because people believe in what we believe in, they can be part of it, but it does change the dynamic. So just being respectful of that as well, yeah.
I would completely agree. We have employee resource groups at Microsoft, and I would say they're super open, but I would say that like they'll sometimes keep some meetings or some aspects kind of to that group for that safe place and for that community. But then what I think is great is there's budget around kind of these more like networking and external events, so really kind of invite everyone to come in and experience that group, get to know that group better, and a chance to get involved. And I think it's the balance and how you kind of create that balance so that you have both aspects to that relationship.
Thank you so much to all of you for coming. It has been a pleasure to spend this time with you. I hope that hearing from our panelists has inspired and empowered you to go out and make this a better world for diversity and inclusion, a world that reflects our values and the people that we want to be able to support.
Please join me in thank you so much, Dan and Don, the panelists, everyone. Our co-sponsors for today's event, our students, and Sam, our CRB staff, and in particular Ava, please. It's a wonderful job coordinating this. Thank you so much, Ava.